And today we'll be looking at Rosemary Dobson's poem Young Girl at a Window. So we're not going to be going through the rubric and we won't be going through the context of Dobson in too much detail, but here are some basics. So you will need to know that Rosemary Dobson is an Australian poet and she was born in 1920, and Dobson's poetry is renowned for its use of measured cadence, love of the austere, and devotion to traditional form. And you'll kind of see this as you study a lot of Dobson's poetry. Like there is a similar pattern across, or a similar type of style that you'll see across her poetry. So, Young Girl at a Window. Now, I'm not sure if you've read it, but if you haven't, you need to go read it. We will read it together, we will analyze it together, but still, I want you to read it on your own and try to make sense of like what's actually going on as a whole. Here are some just basic information about Young Girl at a Window, and it's written in 1943, and it deals with a young girl at the threshold into adulthood. So she is transitioning from childhood into adulthood. And then there is a tension between the experienced, more mature voice with the inexperienced voice of the young persona. So we are hearing the voice of a more mature and more experienced individual. So it's almost as if this person has already gone through what the young girl is going through, and she's guiding her, or guiding the young persona through the transition from childhood into adulthood. So some key words that you'll need to keep in mind of in regards to the human experience would be maturity, childhood, inevitability, and the passage of time. Now, before we actually go on and analyze stanza by stanza, what I want you to do is I want you to pause this video and have a go at quickly reading the poem on your own and trying to make out what is this poem trying to say about maturity? What is it trying to actually say about the human experience and the experience that we all have with the passage of time? I'll give you a few minutes, or pause the video, read the poem for a few minutes, and then after we come back together, we'll sort of unpack the general macro techniques first before delving into a stanza by stanza analysis. So, I'm not going to be going through too much, but what I want you to make note of is that there seems to be somewhat of a structure in the poem here. So we have 3 stanzas, and each of them end with a rhyming couplet. So here we'll be able to see red, dead, light, night, go, and snow. So we have the rhyming couplets at the end of each stanza, and these are all written in iambic tetrameter. And basically, iambic tetrameter is a little bit quicker in pace than iambic pentameter, and therefore it sounds a little hurried. And if you have a look, there is some sort of structure, as I mentioned, in that it's 3 stanzas and they all have 6 lines each. But at the same time, it's written in blank verse. So what you need to just make note of here is that, I'll write it here for you. So the structure is somewhat controlled, but there are irregularities. Now, you need to think, what is that actually trying to convey then? So there is somewhat of a structure and it is somewhat controlled, but why are they including, or why is Dobson including some irregularities here and there? And this kind of mimics almost the tension and the panic that the young girl is experiencing. So we have somewhat of a controlled voice, as we mentioned, but there are irregularities that are mimicking the tension and the panic that the young persona is going through. standing on the threshold into adulthood, or standing in that transition between childhood and adulthood. Now, I'm just going to go into a in-depth stanza by stanza analysis now. Now let's delve into a closer study of the poem. So, as we have established before, there is a experienced and more mature voice. But we also have a inexperienced young persona. It's almost as if this experienced, more mature voice, or the person that this voice belongs to, has already experienced what the young persona is going through at the moment, as she is standing at the threshold between childhood and adulthood, or childhood and womanhood. Now, let's have a look at the first line here. So, lift your hand to the window latch. First things first, I want you to make note of lift. So, we have an imperative. So, remember, imperative, it's a command. And your hand, we have second person. Now, by looking at the window here, we'll be able to also make note of, okay, so the title of this poem was Young Girl at a Window. So this would be a titular reference, right? And you need to make note of the symbolism. So the window is almost like a barrier between the two worlds. So this girl is still in childhood, and she's looking outside this window into a new stage of her life where she's heading towards a new stage, but there's still that very thin barrier that's dividing her world and the new world that she needs to enter. And if you look at the next sentence or the next line here, sighing, turn and move away, right? I want you to just make note of the verb choice here. The fact that she's sighing and she's turning and moving away, that doesn't really show that she's very enthusiastic. So she's not there like, okay, I really want to become an adult, or I really want to go beyond the current world that I'm living in and I want to go into womanhood. She's sighing and she's turning and moving away, and that's indicative of her reluctance. So she's unwilling to embrace a new change or embrace the changes that she must deal with in going into a new stage of her life. Now, by looking at this though, I think what's important is we also need to consider the fact that this poem seems quite didactic. So we have like an experienced voice who has already experienced what the persona is currently experiencing, and basically it almost seems like the experienced and more mature voice is serving as a educational purpose, or she's providing education to this inexperienced young persona. Now, if we move on, more than mortal swords are crossed on thresholds at the end of day. So more than mortal swords are crossed. We have a metaphor here. And we also have the end of day. So threshold and end, I think you could make note of like they are contrasting, right? Or like juxtaposition. We also have a contrast. We have the fading air stained with red. Now that is very blatantly a metaphor. And time was killed, or since time was killed and now lies dead. Now, I think it's important for us to recognize firstly here, there's capitalization, right? But it's also personification. Or you could also, so personification in regards to time was killed and now lies dead. You could also make note of how time has become a proper noun. because of the use of capitalization. But what you also need to recognize here is there are some words that we are able to associate together. So we have mortal, and we also have end, we also have killed and dead. All of these words work together in forming like a lexical chain or word pattern of mortality or death. So if you have a look in this particular stanza, it doesn't really frame the experience of the young persona as one that is positive. So there's like a lot of like connotations or words with connotations with or words with connotations of death, and also like the metaphor of like the fading air is stained with red. That doesn't seem that positive, and therefore you need to make note of how there is this sense of tension that is being presented in stanza 1 in regards to the experience of this young persona or this young girl at a window. Now moving on to stanza 2. All time was lost. Now moving on to stanza 2. All time was lost. Now again we have the same thing, personification, proper noun, capitalization. But someone saw, though nobody spoke and nobody will. So here we have diacope. While in the clock against the wall, the guiltless minute hand is still. The watchful room, the breathless light behoves to you this final night. So there is this idea of time being repeated. So clock, guiltless minute hand. So you can make note of the repeated reference to time, or the idea of like perhaps the passage of time. And you could also make note of like the guiltless minute hand, right? So guiltless, so the diction. So you need to make note of how the minute hand or like time is guiltless. The watchful room, the breathless light. I want you to just make note of the words here. Watchful room, breathless light. You need to make note of how there is this sense of tension or this sense of not suspense, I'd say, but there is this air of tension that is being held onto, and then it says be host to you this final night. Now I want you to make note of like the connotations or like perhaps the diction of hosts. It doesn't really have a negative connotation. It is generally seen as quite positive. So in this final night, the final night of your youth or your final night of childhood innocence or whatever that is, you need to make note of how it seems to be transitioning. There seems to be some sort of transition into a bit more of a hurtful perception. Now, let's move on to stanza 3. So, over the gently turning hills. Now, I think something that you could also make note of is in this particular stanza, there is a little bit more of a reference to nature. So over the gently turning hills and the grass, sheaves and snow. So naturalistic imagery or the reference to nature, it's kind of implying that this journey is one that is a natural part of the human experience. So it's indicating maturity, or like I guess like the transition as natural. A better way to sort of express that would be it is inevitable in the human experience. Now in forward footsteps, so we have the alliterative F sound. I'm sorry, I've missed one in the previous line. So travel a journey with your eyes. So that's also a metaphor, right? Chance assault. Now, I think the diction is quite strong here. So the emotive diction that is coupled together with the caesura here. So it creates a sense of brokenness in the middle of the stanza. This way, the map of living lies. Again, we have the alliterative L sound. The map of living lies. So that's, again, metaphor. And this journey, you must go. I think this is quite important. So, must. So the must here is high modal. So it's going back to the idea that we were talking about before here in regards to the inevitability of maturity. It's not that you have a choice. You're not going to be like, oh yeah, I don't want to grow up or I don't want to mature. And you won't. It's kind of inevitable. Like you do need to deal with it. Now, through grass and sheaves and lastly snow. So here we have polysyndeton. And I think what's important here is essentially there's different elements of the natural world that is being depicted. So it's sort of like through grass and sheaves and lastly snow. And you need to make note of like the various experiences. And you could also, I guess, say like tricolon here as well. So that is the end of Young Girl at a Window. I don't think this poem is too difficult. So it is just basically the whole concept surrounds the idea of maturity and the passage of time, in which you can't really reject the passage of time. You can't really say no to the passage of time or like no to growing up, and you need to embrace it. And as we talked about, so there is a tension between this young inexperienced girl persona, and we also have this tension that is being caused from the existence of this experienced and more mature voice. But it's almost, again, serving as a didactic purpose in which she's guiding this young girl through the experiences that she also had, and she's sort of suggesting like, it's all right, like it's not going to be that bad. And it's kind of evident in like the overarching kind of tonal shift, right, in stanza 3. So there is a tonal shift into stanza 3 from stanza 2, and especially at the beginning. So there is a juxtaposition between the tone in stanza 1 that was a little bit more, I guess, strict, or not strict, I guess a little bit more emotive, a little bit more pessimistic, I would say. But stanza 3 is a little bit more hopeful, and it's a little bit more embracing or accepting of the various experiences or the inevitability of coming to understand that maturity is an inevitable part of the human experience. So that is that. Now what you need to do is you need to write a paragraph for me. So what ideas of maturity in the human experience does Young Girl at a Window explore? Remember the components of paragraph writing. You need a topic sentence. You need maybe a context, but for now, let's just skip over that and let's do analysis 1, 2, 3, and 4, and a concluding sentence. Now, in regards to the analyses that you're writing, please don't just like choose random ones. You need to narrow down on a particular idea that you want to talk about in regards to maturity. So you're not just going to be saying, oh yeah, like Young Girl at a Window explores ideas on maturity. You need to tell me like, what about it? So is it perhaps the inevitability of maturity, or like, again, yeah, so like the fact that we need to embrace the inevitability of maturity in the human experience for whatever reason, that kind of thing. You need to narrow that down in the in the topic sentence. And then in your analyses, you need to ensure that you're justifying that whole concept that you have introduced in the topic sentence. So you're not just getting random quotes, you're actually using the quotes to justify the particular answer that you want to present in this particular body paragraph. Ensure that you're not only focusing on micro techniques, meaning that you're not only focusing on like, metaphors, similes. Obviously they are important, but you also need to think about the poetic form and like what we talked about at the beginning in regards to like, I guess, the iambic tetrameter, and also like the rhyming couplet and the tonal shift between like the beginning section of the poem versus like the last stanza and whatnot. Those are the things that you need to keep in mind as you are writing your analyses. So that is what you'll need to do in the first half of this lesson, and I will catch up with you in the second part. So that is what you need to do for Young Girl at a Window, and I'll see you again soon. So that is what you'll need to do for Young Girl at a Window, and I will see you again soon.